This is the lecture on political corruption, part 4. And the part 3 ended up being cut a little bit short because something weird happened, and so we're just going to pick up from there and continue on. We left off last time talking about this graph and the relationship between economic freedom and corruption. And so just to remind you folks that the idea is that more competition, more choices that the consumer has, then that competition puts pressure on people to deliver better services for better prices, better quality, and so that puts downward pressure on corruption. And you can see in the y-axis that the countries that are on the high end, that they have good, the perceptions are positive that you don't have much corruption in those countries. So it's the same players here, upper right-hand corner: Singapore, New Zealand, Denmark, Finland, Canada, Australia, Hong Kong. And by the way, you've seen that the United States is not the absolute best among these, is sort of these Protestant countries that have a tradition where Protestant is dominant. It's not always at the very top of the list, but it's definitely in that same category with those kinds of countries. So same basic story here, and you see the same folks, the same countries on the low end. We see Venezuela, lower left, Libya, Iran, Kosovo, and so those countries don't have as much economic competitiveness. You don't have as many choices for where you go do business, and there's more monopolies, and maybe the government has more control of all of these things. So again, you may lack choices. And where there's choices, you don't have pressure for better service, and you are more likely to fall into corruption. Okay, now we're just continuing on with the summary of the research about what kind of countries have the most or the least corruption. Okay, so we've taught these first 2 points we talked about already. Governments that more tightly regulate the economy have less corruption. So if there's a lot of quote-unquote policing of economic activities, people watching, and regulators to make sure you're following the rules, following the laws, you get less corruption. If you don't have a lot of regulators, more corruption. Again, you've seen this, the economies that have more competition, more players competing for your business, you tend to have less corruption. Countries with a free press and an independent judiciary have less corruption. So two institutions there. You need to have an independent media that's not controlled by the government, that's not controlled by any one institution, not controlled by big business or anything like that. This independent, has a free voice, and it's also devoted and committed to investigating corruption and bringing it to light, shining a light on it. And once it's exposed, then you tend to see less of it, because this stuff happens in the dark. It happens secretly. So if you can shine a light on it, you tend to get less of it. So you need to have a kind of a free, independent, aggressive, investigative press or media. And then also you need to have an independent judicial system, judges who are willing to throw the book at these people, who have good laws on the books, who are people are getting prosecuted. They're getting charged with crimes, they're getting convicted of crimes, they're getting punished for crimes. So you need to have a good judicial system, and one that's not corrupt, where your judges are getting paid off, or prosecutors are getting paid off, or police officers or these regulatory people are getting paid off. You've got to have a strong criminal justice system that punishes people, punishes them strongly if they're breaking the law. And if you detect and punish corrupt behavior, it serves as a deterrent. The threat of punishment is just as important as anything else. Not only detecting, but it's not enough to detect it, like the media will shine a light on it, but it's not enough just to shine a light on it. If there's no penalties, if there's no consequences, no accountability, well, maybe people know I'm a crook, but I can live with that as long as I don't have to go to jail. But if I'm going to go to prison or jail, maybe I'll think twice about being a crook, right? About being corrupt. So you need to have a strong criminal justice system. Countries with high, this number 4 here is cultural factors. Countries that have a high level of trust, where people trust and believe in each other, tend to have less corruption. Now, maybe the low level of corruption makes people trust each other. So who knows what's causing what here? Maybe in an honest society, people trust each other. In a corrupt society, nobody trusts anybody because they're getting screwed all the time. Anyway, but still, countries that have where citizens trust each other tend to have less corruption. We've already talked about how these northwestern European countries, English-speaking countries that have Protestant traditions, are more reform-minded, more honest-minded, rule-following, law-following kinds of traditions. In countries that have greater general honesty, people are just in the cultures. People are more honest and straightforward and less deceitful. No surprise there, you're going to get less corruption in an honest society. Again, that tends to be those northwestern European countries. And also countries that have less acceptance for power inequality. So again, this isn't so much the case in the United States, but these Scandinavian countries, for example, compared to the rest of the world, tend to have low levels of inequality. That wealth is more evenly distributed among people. And when you see wealth distributed more among people, you tend to get less corruption because the powerful are sort of kept in check more. There's not as much concentrations of power that power corrupts. And the more you have, then the more corrupt you tend to become. So if that power is spread out, if wealth and power and influence is spread out, it tends to make for a more honest society. Now also, we talked about the importance of the traditions of rule of law and also these Protestant kind of reform-minded traditions. Well, the British Empire, had many colonies around the world that they controlled for decades, and they tended to implement legal systems that were British in English traditions of law. That's what we have in the United States as a former colony of the British. We have a legal system that's based in the English tradition. And countries, not just the United States, but any country that was a former colony of the British Empire tend to have less corruption because they've got a strong legal tradition which works against that. So that's come out in the research. 6, countries with more natural resources tend to be more corrupt. You might think, remember that the deprivation theory we talked about at the beginning of the semester, the idea that countries use more state repression if they lack resources, if they're poor, if they're deprived, they get desperate and they use violence and they violate citizens' rights out of not having a lot of tools in their toolbox. So they don't have a lot of choices, and so they feel like they have to get desperate with cruel tactics. This finding goes against that sort of, in the sense that countries that have a lot of natural resources, they tend to have more corruption. And it seems to be what's going on there is that if you are a country that's got a lot of oil, for example, say you're Saudi Arabia or something like that, you've got this tremendous oil and all this tremendous wealth under the ground. Well, that can tend to make people kind of greedy and want to get in on that. There's people with deep pockets, and so there's temptation there to get corrupt, to do dirty dealings, because there's a lot of money to be made there. If it's a really poor country has few resources, there's not a lot to exploit there, right? There's not a lot to take advantage of, to cheat your way to get some of those resources. And so it's a little bit counterintuitive, I think, that countries that have more natural resources, a lot going for that country in terms of natural resources, that actually ends up working towards more corruption, which is, as I say, maybe the opposite of what you expect, because we usually think of wealth as helping things, resources as helping people, but here it actually creates temptations which people take advantage of. Okay, a major consequence. Now, this is all, we just have gone over all of the according to the research, what's correlated with corruption. But let's finish off this discussion or this lecture with, okay, so you got a lot of corruption in your country, and the negative consequences to the people of that country are pretty obvious. We don't have to go through all of those. If you have people cheating you left and right and getting their interests fulfilled at the expense of your interests or at the expense of the country's interests, well, that's a pretty obvious negative consequence. But also, there's one other thing I want to mention before we wrap it up. If you countries that are just rife with corruption, people from other countries don't want to deal with them. They don't want to invest in businesses in your country. They don't want to do business with you in any way, because if they see you as being corrupt, they're thinking any money or any effort, any time or energy that I invest, that I sink into that country is going to disappear, because it's dishonest, it's corrupt, and I'm not going to be able to get something back, get a return on the investment, if it's corrupt. And it's not even just the investment mentality or the way a business person would think about this, but also think charitable organizations. Why would I want to take my precious funds that I have devoted to the poor or to needy people who need help? I only have so many resources to share. Why would I want to share those resources in a highly corrupt country where I know that money is not going to go into the hands of the people who truly need it? It's going to go into the hands of these corrupt politicians, these powerful people that run the country, who don't do things in the interest of the common people, the ordinary people, the people who need help. They do things in the interest of themselves and their buddies. So they pocket the money. Why would I want to throw my money away and just put it in the pockets of these people who are wealthy already, where the money and the help is not going to get to the people who need it? So the poorest people always take the worst of these negative things. When bad things happen in a country, when you have negative characteristics in a country, it's typically the people at the bottom who get hit the hardest. And that's true for corruption, like so many other things. Okay, let's end it there.